It's September 1777. General Burgoyne is marching towards Albany in an attack he hopes will end the revolution. His plan has been to attack the city from three sides, splitting the colonies in half and forcing an end to the war. However, things have not gone according to plan. The attack from the west has been thoroughly routed by a counterattack launched by General Benedict Arnold. In the south, General Howe has decided to attack the American capital to the south rather than obey Burgoyne's orders and march towards Albany. Now, Burgoyne has unexpectedly left all alone in northern New York. His supplies are low due to having his baggage train being harassed by American and native forces, and compounding his issues, an unexpected American victory at the Battle of Bennington has shaken his men's confidence in the war. Not wanting to bring disgrace to the British and dishonor to himself, he determines that he will march towards Albany with all haste and take the Americans head on. Meanwhile, just north of Albany, near a place called Saratoga, the Americans are fortifying a position and preparing to try and save New York from falling. This is Grim Italia, and you're watching my series on battles of the American Revolution. This is the Battles of Saratoga. Horotio Gates is placed in command of the troops at Saratoga. He commands a force of around 9,000 men. The American forces begin to dig in. They construct a fortress and fortifications along the area known as Bemis Heights and erect a chain blocking the Hudson River. With the river blocked, Burgoyne will not be able to use the river to aid with naval support or reach Albany. Burgoyne, meanwhile, plans to launch a three-pronged attack against the Americans. He plans to move the Haitians, numbering nearly 3,000 men, and most of those artillery down a main road along the river. With their artillery, they will bombard the Americans, forcing their attention to the right flank. Meanwhile, a small group of British, numbering around 2,000, will move down the center in an attempt to tie the Americans down in an engagement. At the same time, a larger group of British forces, numbering around 3,000, will move through the forest and attempt to turn the Americans' flank with a surprise attack. There's an area of high ground just to the west of the heights. If this position is secured, Burgoyne can move his artillery and barrage the Americans, driving them from Bemis Heights and clearing the path directly to Albany. On September 19th, the British attack begins. Burgoyne orders his men to move out and begin the assault. Though Gates believes the troops should hold the center to defend the fort at all costs, Arnold has convinced him that a flanking attack could devastate the position. He receives permission to send two small regiments under the command of Daniel Morgan to scout the American far left. These men are armed with a new weapon, the Pennsylvania rifle. Shipped in from the American colonial frontier, the weapon is slower to reload but has a groove barrel, making it far more accurate than any other weapons of the day. They begin firing upon the British center. The center is already advancing slowly due to the forested terrain and the need to build a bridge over the river. The Americans under Morgan are devastating the British ranks. With their extremely accurate rifles, they're targeting British officers specifically. The sharpshooters manage to kill nearly every officer of the British vanguard, causing much confusion. The British troops fall back, and there was such disarray that they were fired upon by their own men, and many of them died in the chaos. More British troops soon begin to arrive, and the British begin to form a proper battle line. Morgan's men are being pressured and will soon be forced to fall back under the British's overwhelming numbers. They call for reinforcements, and the Americans answer. By 3 p.m., the American reinforcements have arrived, and the engagement transforms from a skirmish into a pitched battle. The British attempt to launch a bayonet charge, a tactic which has worked for them so many times in the past. However, the Americans are in a strong position on the other side of a river, sheltered and within a forest. The British have already lost many of their leaders. The charge is slow to organize and advance. They're driven back by the Americans' disciplined defenses. The British on the American left receive an order to join the battle and reinforce the center. They move forward, threatening the American right flank or left flank, but Arnold has called for reinforcements, and the Americans arrive in time to hold the British back. As American reinforcements continue to join the battle, the British center begins to be overwhelmed. Soon, a large gap on the British side between their center and their right flank has opened up. If the Americans can penetrate this flank, they'll be able to completely encircle and outflank the British army, surrounding and trapping much of their force. Arnold implores Gates to send more men immediately to take advantage of this weakness. Gates, however, declines, believing it an unnecessary risk, and preferring to keep his army in the fortified heights rather than risking the entire campaign on the battlefield. It's generally accepted that had he sent the men, the Americans could have overwhelmed the British and won the victory right here. Eventually, the Haitians on the American right flank make their way towards the center to reinforce the collapsing British army. When they arrive, they outflank the American force and devastate them. The Americans are forced to pull back to the safety of Bemis Heights, and the British claim the battle as a victory. The British had won the day, but at a terrible cost. They lost dozens of officers and nearly 600 casualties, while the Americans had took only 300. The British, in this single battle, had lost 10% of their army and much more of their officer corps. Meanwhile, in the American camp, a rivalry that had been brewing between Gates and Arnold finally exploded into open hostility. Gates had written a letter to the Congress and to the governor of New York, where he reported the action of the battle, but he failed to mention Arnold at all, the second such time that this had happened to Arnold. Almost all of the troops involved in the battle universally credited Arnold with the victory, since he had been the one in the field and the one directing the battle, while Gates had sat in his tent. A shouting match erupted between the two, which resulted in Arnold being relieved of his command. He wrote to General Washington requesting a reassignment, which he was granted, but he subsequently decided to stay in camp instead. He wandered the camp and encouraged agitation amongst the American soldiers for his mistreatment. The soldiers would later sign a petition asking for Arnold's command to be restored, but this fell upon Gates' deaf ears. Meanwhile, Burgoyne received word from General Clinton that he had replaced Howe in New York. Clinton stated that he would try to make his way north to assist. Burgoyne had planned an attack, but now he puts it off and decides he should wait. He digs in and builds a series of redoubts across the area of Saratoga to await reinforcements. Clinton makes his advance on October 5th and captures Fort Montgomery in lower New York. However, this is too little too late. At his current rate, he will never be able to reach Burgoyne before British supplies run out. At the same time, the American forces under General Brown had been moving towards Ticonderoga, and they finally reached the fort. They're unable to capture it, but they cause the British over 250 casualties, free 150 American prisoners, and take only 10 casualties themselves. The action also further disrupts the already strained supply lines leading to Burgoyne's forces at Saratoga. Now, the army of 2,000 Americans turns around and marches back towards Albany to reinforce the Americans. The Americans, now, for one of the first times, have the British outnumbered in the coming battle. Burgoyne is now left with two options. He can withdraw back to Canada, or he can attack immediately before supplies run out. Believing that withdrawing would be disgraceful, he decides he must attack. On October 6th, he orders his men forward. They position themselves at a clearing in the forest to the west of the American position. They only plan to scout the Americans to see if an attack is possible. In the American fort, scouts inform Gates of the British movements. Gates decides to send out a force of nearly 6,000 men to confront the British, to take position in a forest opposite of the British position. At 2 p.m., the battle begins. Shots are fired by the British across the center as the troops advance. There's a fierce volley between the forces, but the Americans, with the protection afforded to them by the trees, are holding their ground. The British launch a small artillery barrage on the American position, but they find they're unable to cause them much damage. On the American right, a British commander orders a bayonet charge. He rallies the troops and they surge forward towards the Americans. However, the skilled American snipers are able to easily spot the general in his regal uniform and shoot him down. When the general falls, the British morale drops suddenly. The troops fall back. On the American right, the British are being outmaneuvered by the Americans. The American troops begin to advance and push the British back. Some of the British are attempting to move west to outflank the Americans, but the pressure from the American advance is too great, and the British are forced back across the line. This first phase of the battle lasted about an hour and cost the British nearly 500 men, 10 cannons, and their entire Grenadier Corps. There was a brief lull where the British attempted to regroup and fall back to their fortified redoubts. The Americans, were then unexpectedly joined by a new participant. Benedict Arnold surged out from Bemis Heights to take command of the battlefield. Arnold had been drinking heavily in the fort and was walking around spreading great anger amongst the men. Gates immediately sent out an officer to recall Arnold, but it was too late. Arnold rushed forward to the American right flank. He rode out ahead of his men and charged the remaining British forces, who collapsed and fell into disarray. He then led his men through a gap that emerged between the two British redoubts, capturing the southernmost one. On the American left, the commander-in-charge, General Poor, saw Arnold's advance and ordered his men forward to support him. They attacked the northern redoubt, but it was heavily fortified and well defended. The Americans became stuck, unable to advance any further. Still in his drunken fury, Arnold decided to take action. He rode across the entire line, zagging between the troops, all the way to the American left. The men watching from both sides were stunned that he wasn't shot dead. He took command of a regiment of soldiers and led them around the British defenses. They emerged behind the redoubt, successfully flanking the enemy position. The Americans moved forward and began firing at close range. A British officer described how the American militia swarmed around the little adverse army like birds of prey. During the heated battle, Arnold was shot twice in the knee and wounded. He would carry a limp for the rest of his life. The British were soon overrun and forced to retreat. However, at this point, it was close to nightfall, and the Americans were unable to pursue. As they retreated, General John Stark appeared with around 1,100 men, blocking the last northern escape route and trapping the British force. Burgoyne had lost over 1,000 men in the battle, while the Americans had lost around 500. This left Burgoyne outnumbered 3-1 by the Americans, and on October 14th, Burgoyne formally asked to surrender. The surrender of an entire British army had a tremendous psychological impact on the American cause. It granted the Americans access to all the artillery and equipment which Burgoyne's army had been carrying. The French, already impressed with the American efforts at Brandywine and Germantown, saw this victory and determined that the Americans had a real possibility of winning the war. French King Louis XVI formally signed a treaty on February 6, 1778, pledging full military support to the American cause. General Clinton, who had been marching to meet Burgoyne in Albany, hastily turned his force around and retreated back to New York. By the end of 1777, the British held on to only New York City, Philadelphia, and Newport. Within 6 months, they'd be forced to abandon Philadelphia. They would change strategies and instead begin a campaign on the South. This strategy would prove far more effective than their attempts at pursuing the war in the North. If you enjoyed this video, please come back next week as we watch the drama unfold as the British slowly move out and recapture much of the colonial southern territories. This was Grim Battaglia. If you liked my video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching, and never stop learning.